For the last 80 years, since the end of World War II, we've all kind of had a pretty good idea of what the world was supposed to look like. Moving towards freer trade, moving towards globalization. You had the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank to help manage the global economy. You had NATO for collective defense. The U.S. played a leadership role in the world at some expense, but it was an expense that the U.S. was willing to bear for the sake of the world. All of that is now being called into question. All of it is being called into question, raising a lot of issues about what comes next. And I've really been looking forward to this next conversation because this is the one person that I'm eager to hear answer those big questions. She is the former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. She's also a member of the C3 AI board, and let's welcome her to the stage now, please. It's an honor to have you here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. I can't open the way that Jim did, though. I'm from Alabama, not Greenland. It's not exactly the same kind of thing. Yes.
You need clear direction in Alabama, too.
Yes.
So many things that I would like us to talk about, and we have a limited time to talk about them in. But I want to start with that big question. I mean, it's pretty clear, I think, that the old order is ending, has been for some time, but it's accelerated in the last couple of months. But it's not clear to me at all what the new order is. Can you clear that up for us? It has, and by the way, it has huge implications for businesses, like where you put your plant, how you manage your supply chain.
It does. I would say that we don't know what the new order is going to be, but we do know that the old order is passing away, so to speak. And I would say there are really three reasons that the old order is passing away. One is that you are having the reemergence of great power conflict. Even at the time of the Soviet Union, we didn't have the kind of territorial conflicts that you're seeing, Russia invading Ukraine, China threatening the South China Sea and Taiwan. And it looks more 19th century or early 20th century in that regard, and so that's one complication now. Secondly, the international economic order, which you so aptly described, really is under a lot of pressure. There was a time when globalization seemed to just be moving inexorably forward. You would have your supply chains wherever it was more efficient. You would have investment wherever it was likely to bring the greatest return. You would do everything on the notion of efficiency and returns. And you really didn't worry much because the entire globe was open to you. In particular, China was open to you. That system of an international economy that was positive sum, not zero sum, everybody was going to get more prosperous, actually worked really, really well for...
It wasn't a mistake for the time?
It was not a mistake. It worked really, really well. But a couple of things that we didn't see coming. The first is China kind of defected from that system. And it began to really draw from the international order in ways that became quite concerning to the United States. So, you know, before Xi Jinping, the word was you cannot have economic liberalization and political control. And in fact, China was beginning to, in some ways, you had a huge private sector. I worked with Hu Jintao. It looked very different. Yeah. And Xi Jinping came to power and he said, thank you very much, I'll take political control. And that began to change China's interaction with the international system, with the international economy, in security terms, more adversarial. And so that system where we had just assumed that even if you had a country that had a different political and social system, you could integrate it economically, that turned out to be a problem. Secondly, I think we forget that globalization, it really benefited an awful lot of people, and at a macro level, it was terrific. There were a lot of people who got left out, and if you were that unemployed coal miner in West Virginia or that unemployed steel worker in Great Britain, you didn't see globalization in quite the same terms. And those people then began to put pressure for what we're seeing now. I've called them the four horsemen of the apocalypse: populism, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism, and they tend to ride together. And so that system that you described is under a lot of pressure, and that's very hard on businesses because you'd become accustomed to a certain certainty about how the international economy
Should we
would
have
work.
seen that coming? Should we have done more a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades ago to deal with that group?
Absolutely. I've been asked, is the Trump a revolution or an evolution? Well, a revolution is what happens when you don't see an evolution coming. And that's precisely what happened. Yes, for a number of years, this was kind of ignored. I was just going to mention the third point is what we're here to talk about, which is these transformative technologies that really are changing everything about life, everything about business. And that's where the geopolitics becomes very interesting, because if you think about AI, there are really two major players. There's the United States and there's China, and they're adversaries. And they've become technological adversaries, with decoupling more and more from China on technology. Now, I have to acknowledge Great Britain is a player in AI because of Oxford largely. But you're really talking about China and the United States, and it's become a kind of technological arms race.
Yeah. I want to do all three of those, but let's start with the first, great power conflict. I mean, as you said, the obvious manifestation of that right now is the war in Ukraine. And what we've seen President Trump came into office saying, I'm going to fix that. Seems to be a little more difficult than he thought. But the other thing I think that's been surprising to a lot of people is he seemed to be cozying up to Putin, who was clearly the aggressor in the war. What's that all about?
Well, I think President Trump wants to make a deal. And he believes he can stop this war. And I've talked to people in the administration. They say, we can't do it by name-calling Putin. We have to have the other partner at the table. They are right, the war needs to end. The fact is that if we had probably given Ukraine everything it needed right up front when the Russians were on their back foot, maybe Ukraine would have won this war. Back in 2022, Vladimir Putin had sent his armed forces into that war with 5 days provisions and their dress uniforms for the parade in Kyiv. That's how long they thought this was going to take. And so at that point, they were on their back foot. But by kind of incrementally giving Ukraine just enough to keep the war going, what we saw was Russia begin to get to do what it's done historically, began to depend on its mass. So think about now a population 4 to 5 times larger than the Ukrainian population. And Vladimir Putin is just throwing men at the front. And oh, by the way, Alan, they're not those blonde boys from Moscow and St. Petersburg. They're poor kids from Dagestan and from Khabarovsk and a few North Koreans. And they have had 600,000 casualties and 200,000 deaths. And they just keep throwing people. So the Ukrainians do need this war to stop. But it has to stop, and this is what I hope the administration will do. It has to stop in a way that Ukraine remains independent, that Ukraine remains with its, what territory it now holds intact. It's not going to get back those eastern provinces right now. But if it can remain independent and secure, it can become prosperous on the territory in the West, which is really where the bulk of the modern Ukrainian economy is in any case.
But you said secure. Let's talk about the secure piece of that for a minute, because I mean, Putin's a known quantity. If he gets to keep all his gains, if we don't put Ukraine in NATO, which we're not going to do, then what's to keep, after Trump has left office, from Putin going on and finishing the job? Everything about his history tells us that's what he will do.
Well, let me be very clear. I would put Ukraine in NATO if I had the choice.
You would?
I would. We don't have the choice. It's not going to happen. You would.
We don't have the choice because?
Because you will not get a 2/3 vote of the Senate to do that.
It's U.S. politics.
It's U.S. Well, it's an attack upon one is an attack upon all, which is Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Asking Americans to take that on vis-a-vis Ukraine is pretty difficult. It's a lot. But there are ways to have security for Ukraine. The first is, if the Europeans really are willing to put as they've said, 30,000 or so peacekeepers to enforce a ceasefire. That's an element of security. The administration believes, and it's not a crazy idea, that if you can integrate the Ukrainian economy, that's the mineral deal that you read so much about, then the United States has a stake in Ukraine, and that's a deterrent. Remember, you're just trying to deter Vladimir Putin. The final point is the Ukrainians have become quite adept in their own defense. They have the largest land army in Europe. They have a quite sophisticated defense industry. What they need is time to get to the place over the next 5, 6, 7 years where the bulk of the defense is because they can defend themselves, and they can hold at risk elements in Russia that Putin would care about.
But they're going to have a massive rebuilding job on their hands. They're just going to have to.
They are going to have a massive rebuilding job. If it doesn't include the eastern provinces, which is all Rust Belt, that will help, because now you're rebuilding a part of Ukraine that can become prosperous relatively quickly. But I just want to emphasize, there have to be several elements of this. One is you're probably going to have Europeans on the ground. Secondly, the Ukrainians are going to have to accelerate their own defenses. They're going to have to hold at risk things that Russia cares about. One of the things that's very often forgotten is the Ukrainians were able to expel the Russian Navy from Sevastopol, which they have held since Catherine the Great. They don't even have a navy. They did it with drones. So amazing. The sophistication of modern warfare gives them a chance. And the final point I'll make is, you know, you and I may sit here and say, if a French soldier or a German soldier is overrun by Vladimir Putin, would the United States come to their aid? And you and I might debate that. It doesn't matter what we think. Would Vladimir Putin take that chance? That's really what you have to do. You have to deter him from doing that. So I think there's a deal there to be done. I'm just hoping that it's not a deal that acknowledges in any way the Russian aggression, which would mean you would not recognize Russia's forces in those provinces. You would simply say that that territory still remains Ukrainian. Even at this moment, Ukraine cannot control it.
Symbolic but important symbolism.
Well, this is what we did for the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. We didn't recognize the Soviet occupation of those states for 45 years. We, to this day, do not recognize the Russian occupation of Abkhazia and Ossetia in Georgia. And a funny thing happens. If the United States doesn't recognize territory, nobody will invest. And so Vladimir Putin may find it hard. And I just want to make one other point because it's important to industry. The Russian energy sector is in really bad shape. And I think one of the reasons Putin might want an end to this war is he desperately needs investment again in his energy sector. Those very difficult to reach fields up around Sakhalin, for instance, those fields can only be developed by the supermajors, the Exxons and the Shells of the world. And Gazprom leaked a memo that they will not be profitable again until 2035.
Whoa.
Because they're selling discounted oil and they're harvesting everything to prosecute this war. Putin cares about his energy sector, and I can tell you that because that's his big man sector, right? What you dig out of the ground.
That's what he needs.
That's what he needs, and I would bet you that that's why he wants this deal, because he thinks Donald Trump can deliver the Russian energy sector from the purgatory that it's in right now.
Interesting. Let's move to the Middle East. That war, based on the last 24 hours, isn't getting any better, seems to be getting worse. How dangerous is that?
Well, there are two Middle Easts right now. On the one hand, you've got what's going on in Gaza, the old Middle East, I'll call it. I had 5 different Gaza crises, none of them quite as dramatic as what happened on October 7th. I think everyone had hoped that the ceasefire would hold. It's going to be very difficult to rebuild Gaza, per se. But that war, I had hoped that, and it will eventually be the case, that the Israelis will go more to kind of hit-and-run operations to just keep Hamas down. I was a little surprised to hear that they've put ground troops in Gaza. I negotiated the Israelis out of Gaza in 2005 because Ariel Sharon said he wanted no part of Gaza. It wasn't defensible. Eventually, the Israelis need to turn to what is really the future of Israel, which is right now, companies are a little nervous about investing in Israel. Israel is the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to technology in the region, and that's the future of Israel. So finding a way to end that war. And then the other Middle East is what's happening in the Gulf. If you've been to Dubai or to Doha or to Riyadh, you will see that that Middle East is having the same conversations that we're having here about AI. They're having the same conversations about who can supply the energy requirements for what we know is a very energy-intensive technology, which is AI. And that Middle East, the Gulf in particular, would like to get back to the normalization talks with the Israelis, particularly the Saudis, who have big plans for Saudi Arabia that looks more like Dubai than the old Saudi Arabia. It's a little hard to do it when you have what's going on in Gaza.
It's in their interest to see this put to rest.
It's in their interest to see this put to rest, to end. And then perhaps you can get back to the normalization, which is really the future. If you want Saudi 2030 to work, which is MBS's plan for Saudi, you need to end the state of war with Israel through normalization and begin to take advantage of that technology.
So China, which you've already referred to, Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he wants Taiwan to become part of China before the end of his term, whatever that might be. He won't live forever.
No.
So you're probably looking at the next decade. Are we ready for that? Is the U.S. government ready for that? Is the business world ready for that? What are the implications of Xi taking Taiwan?
People very often focus on 2027, which is the end of this coming term. And given that things haven't gone all that well under Xi Jinping in terms of the economy, you have 20% youth unemployment. It's not a very pretty picture. So maybe no guarantee that he would get another term. So does he have to solve this by 2027 is the question on everybody's mind. But when you talk to military people, they will tell you that an amphibious landing on Taiwan is like D-Day times 20. And can they even trust their military? If you're Xi Jinping, you've got to look at what happened to Vladimir Putin's military and say, how good really is the PLA? Hu Jintao once told us that the PLA was rife with corruption. You might notice that Xi Jinping keeps firing defense ministers. So maybe he doesn't really trust his own military. So what does that mean? You don't have to invade Taiwan. You just have to try to turn Taiwan into something that looks like Hong Kong. Hong Kong, which not economically, but politically, in terms of security, is really just another province of China now. And how would you do that in Taiwan? Well, we're seeing some of it. If you watch closely, the Chinese are doing what you would call denial or quarantine exercises all the time. So you might use a quarantine or denial exercises. Cyber attacks, which are accelerating. Cut a few underwater sea cables. Seize an island that's closer to China than to Taiwan, but that Taiwan claims. What would be the purpose? It would be to try to bring a pro-Beijing government to power in Taiwan.
Although so far it seems to be working in the opposite direction.
I was just going to say, they always misread this. But that would be the goal. And I do think we're not quite prepared for what meaning the United States, for what I would call those salami tactics, right? If there were an all-out invasion, we would know what to do. But if it's just cutting underwater sea cables or seizing an island, do we really know what to do? It's harder to respond. And you're seeing a lot of pressure on Taiwan. So I hope that Xi Jinping is not reading our desire to see an end to the war in Ukraine the wrong way and thinking what he might be able to do vis-a-vis Taiwan.
I want to get to AI pretty quickly, but first I need to ask you about tariffs, because it's clear this administration views tariffs as much as a tool of national security policy and foreign policy as of economic policy. This is part of their sense of how to reorder the world.
Well, one might say that some tariffs have some economic sense. China is dumping out of its excess capacity, for instance. But Canada and Mexico?
Right.
I mean, what did Canada ever do to us, actually? It's kind of a sad story. I'd just like them to win the Stanley Cup again. They haven't done it since '93, you know?
I don't know if you can accomplish that with tariffs.
Yeah, right, exactly. But here's the problem, Alan. There's a kind of parlor game in Washington. Are these just negotiating ploys? And even negotiating ploys about things that are not even economic, so immigration policy. I think there's something deeper, which is, it goes back to your first point about the international economy. There are people in the Trump administration, and I think the president is actually one of them, who believe that the international economy has not benefited the United States. That you remember in the campaign, he would say, they're laughing at us, we're suckers.
Yeah.
And they take as evidence that we have trade imbalances in various places. We know that trade balances are simply a reflection of kind of a ledger of goods and services. But that's not how they see it. They see it as if there's a trade imbalance, somebody's been cheating us. And so that's a different view. And then tariffs become a way to, quote, equalize what is happening. And it becomes much stickier as a policy than if you were just using it for economic purposes, and you might be able to cut some deal where somebody buys more Boeing aircraft, which is what the Chinese used to always offer, by the way.
But one thing we always thought in the first Trump term was that Trump, creature of New York, very sensitive to the markets. If the markets reacted, he would back off. Well, here we are, 3 weeks in, major correction, no sign that he's backing off.
No, I think we're going to have a significant period of uncertainty. I think he's willing to live with a significant period of uncertainty. I wouldn't expect the policies also to be terribly coherent, because on the one hand, he wants to lower inflation, but tariffs are not going to lower inflation. I suspect that inside you've got a kind of tug of war, because let's face it, people like the Commerce Secretary Ludnick, or the Treasury Secretary Bessent, or Kevin Hassett, who's the National Economic Advisor, these people understand that these policies are not coherent. But the president's a bit his own action officer, which is not easy if you're secretary of something. And so I don't think that I think you'll see policies that swing. It was a little surprising to me, and I'll bet it was a little surprising even inside the administration, when the president effectively said, recession, so what? Don't think I've ever heard a president say that.
I don't remember hearing that
I don't ever remember, and you've been around a long time, I don't think I've ever heard that. So if he is indeed willing for short-term pain, as he would put it, to correct what he thinks is an imbalance in the international economy, because the United States has been taken advantage of, that's a very different environment than he's just negotiating.
All right, let's move to AI. There's so many things I'd love to talk to you about, but it was Vladimir Putin who said, "Whoever controls AI will control the world." Yeah. Fortunately, it's pretty clear that's not going to be Vladimir
It's not
Putin,
Russia.
right? But there is that issue between the U.S. and China. Do you think that's a correct comment? Is that what's at stake here? Who runs the world 20 years from now?
We've been talking about it. This technology is so transformative, and it's not just transformative as a standalone, but of course, how it enables everything else. So you think about robotics, and how AI-enabled robotics looks different than robotics that's not AI-enabled. I'm at Stanford. We do a lot of high technology work. They will tell you that AI-emboldened space will look different. So yes, it's a transformative. A friend of mine, Fei-Fei Li, calls it a civilizational technology. Yep. This is a huge leap. And I've been asked very many times, will AI end up on the battlefield? Every technology ends up on the battlefield.
It will, of course.
So the first thing is, yes, it will end up as a national security issue. Secondly, I would like to see a democracy win this race. Why? Because we don't know what could go, quote, wrong with AI. But I can guarantee you if something's going off, we'll have investigative reporting. We'll have congressional hearings. Your friends at The Economist will be writing about it. Well, will China do those things if things are going wrong? No, they'll treat it like they treated COVID. It'll hide.
Yeah.
We won't know what's going on.
Well, we already see that in law enforcement, right? Law enforcement has been transformed in China because everywhere you go, there are cameras looking at you and they collect it and use it.
Exactly, and the data collection. The other point, though, is that it really is a race. And in this sense, DeepSeek was a bit of a shock. Now, the interesting point is, my computer science friends at Stanford, they said DeepSeek wasn't a shock at all. They saw it coming. It was open source. For the national security community, it was a thunderbolt. Because we thought we had this big lead with generative AI, and you couldn't get the NVIDIA chip, and so forth and so on if you were China. And so it said two things that are unnerving for the national security community. One is maybe the United States isn't that far ahead, and the other is export controls don't really
They don't work. Yeah, that's what I was going to
And
ask.
that's a very bad, look, people like me, national security types, we love export controls. We just love them because it makes you feel like you're doing something to stop your adversary. If you can only stop it for so long.
Yeah, and so what do you do about that? I mean, the other thing about DeepSeek is it may not signal that they're that much ahead. It just means that in an open source world, we gave them what they needed to rapidly train.
Which is why export controls
don't work. But then should there be some deeper divide between the U.S. and China that doesn't give them access to our LLMs?
You're going to continue to have export controls. Let me just tell you, you are, because like I said, national security people, it's something you can do. I think we could do some things that I would say would be foolhardy. So I don't believe in saying Chinese students can't be in our labs. And if we do better in an open environment, even if it ends up with some of the secrets going to an adversary, we're still going to learn more in an open environment than in a closed one. Not to mention that those Chinese students may turn out to be people that if we had better immigration policies might want to stay here in the United States.
Fei Li, I don't know.
Fei Li, whose parents brought her here. The final point that I'd make about this is, what this really means is the United States needs to run hard and fast.
Yeah.
Really, really hard and fast.
Yeah.
And I'm not one for much in the way of regulation in this regard. I know that there will be some mistakes. I know that human beings have always been better at the knowledge part than at the wisdom part, but I'll take my chances.
We're going to talk about this on a panel tomorrow, but the U.S. Defense Department running fast has not been its thing.
It hasn't been its strong suit, but if the Pentagon can get to the place, and I think there are people who want to do this, that rather than everything has to be a big RFP that takes years with legions of lobbyists, and you'll kill off small companies who may have really important answers. So I do think there have been people in the Pentagon for some time who've been trying to think about the acquisition policies that we have, and can we change that? And the other point I'll make about running hard and fast is, and I say this to my European friends all the time, leave out the UK, Europe is in danger of being the regulatory state, not the innovation state.
Yeah.
And that has to be, you had the Draghi report some time ago that really made this point. We need Europe to take what is considerable power, intellectual power, engineering capability and so forth, and turn it toward innovation.
Yeah. My favorite question, Doge, Elon Musk.
Oh, yeah.
Is he helping or hurting? I mean, you got a bunch of very savvy tech bros who are now like right in the middle of government. Is that going to accelerate the transition or set us back?
Alan, I grew up in the Silicon Valley, right? And to a certain extent, I love it. And I think the innovation and the energy and, you know, the C3 AIs that are created out of I just love it. But it is a place that sometimes everything looks like a nail, so everything needs a hammer. And it is technology, technology, technology. And
not diplomacy.
Not diplomacy or not. The federal government should be a lot smaller. I'm going to pull out a number. I've often said 20% of the federal workforce could probably be cut. You'd never know it. But you want to do it in a way that you cut the right 20%.
Yeah.
And I'm a little afraid that what they've done, one of the edicts was that you had to cut what are called probationary employees. Those are people who've been there 2 years or less. A lot of those were the young people who were hired with data science skills because the government finally realized they needed data science skills. So I think the president even said it, a little bit more of a scalpel, a little bit less of a hammer. The other point is that you have actually in this administration some very good heads of these agencies, secretaries of various agencies. Let them do the work, right? You don't need somebody to parachute into the State Department or parachute into...
With a machete.
With a machete. Just, you have good secretaries, let them make good choices. One final point, though. I am not against the idea that some of the agencies that we have and we probably do need to sunset a lot of what we've been doing.
Yeah.
When I was secretary, it was always really frustrating because when I would get ready to do the budget presentation, you know, you go to defend the budget, I'd have my budget hearing, or my budget preparation, and somebody would say, oh, well, I'd say, well, what's that program? They say, oh, well, you know, it's just $1 million. You have your staff can answer it. Finally, I started saying, you know what? $1 million is a lot of money where I come from. What does that program do? Nobody could really tell you. And so there's a lot of cleanup needed in the federal government.
What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night is a little bit where you started this. The United States of America, for all our mistakes and all of the issues that we have both internally and externally, I do think that without American leadership, it would have been a less prosperous, certainly a less freer, and a less secure world. Yeah. And for 80 years or so, we've carried that banner. I know that it's tough. I know Americans are tired. In August of 2008, I was with President Bush in the Oval Office, and Karl Rove came in with some poll that the Bush administration wasn't very popular, and President Bush said, we couldn't possibly be that popular. And I said, you know, Mr. President, they're tired of us. Right? It's been war. It's been terrorism. They're tired of us. I did say I'm tired of them, too. But America can't afford to be tired because great powers don't mind their own business. And if the United States doesn't shape the international environment,
who will?
Who will? Yeah. Russia, China, that's not a world I want to live in.
Last question. I'm stealing this from somebody who asked you over there. Yeah. Condi Rice for president.
Oh, no.
Why not? Look, all these votes.
Yeah.
All these votes.
Yeah. Let me just be very clear. I don't have that DNA. I would last about 20 minutes in a campaign. We got a lot of good people. I'll go back to teaching at Stanford and being on the C3AI board.
Well, thank you. Please. Thanks so much.